Next on our list of to-dos is the Central Deborah Mine Tour, the underground tour in Bendigo, about to flip you around. We're running a little bit late, so we've got to rush in and get in there quick smart. Also the home of the tram stop too, as you can see. But just beyond that is the Central Deborah Mine, and hopefully I'll be able to take some footage while we're in there.
Until 1954, when the Central Deborah Gold Mine stopped operating. It's one of the last mines during the gold rush era here in Bendigo. In that 103-year period, a total of 720,000 kilograms of gold was mined from the Bendigo goldfields. Now that makes Bendigo #1 in Victoria. Not Ballarat, everyone thinks it's Ballarat. They were #3. They're kind of like, it's not compared to our very large amount of gold. Fort Castlemaine was #2. No one remembers Castlemaine, which is funny because Castlemaine is brilliant.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Do I have anyone here from Castlemaine? Talk them up. So, the Bendigo Goldfields is an area that spans 15 kilometres north to south, 5 kilometres east to west, and in that area there were 5,500 registered gold mines. So as you can imagine, back in the day, the entire Bendigo landscape was barren because they had chopped down all the trees for mining. There was more wood underground at one stage than there was up on the surface. And then what they do is they set up structures such as this big white thing right here. This is called a poppet head or a poppet legs. And this is what stands directly over the mine shaft. So very briefly in the sunshine, this way, take a look at the mine shaft. So this right here, this is where the miners would enter and exit the mine back in the 1940s. Now, that's a fairly steep drop, 422 metres down this mine goes. That's really shallow by Bendigo standards though. The deepest mine in Bendigo was 1,406 metres deep. That's really shallow by worldwide standards today though. The deepest mine in the world today is in South Africa. It is nearly 4 kilometres deep. We're getting deeper and deeper. Now these are the cages that the miners put underground. They are incredibly small. You can only fit 4 miners at a time in one of those. They're basically designed around the shape of the mine. Alrighty then. Can everyone up the back see me? Hello! That's always a good sign. I can see a thumbs up. My head's too small for this. Oh, gosh. No, it's too small.
Why is it so loose? The white one's a bit big, the blue one's too small.
Can I actually have my phone? Yeah. Now, it does feel like it's going to come off. So when I do this, it jiggles a bit. Yeah, that's normal.
That's good.
Yeah. So it feels like it's going to fall off sometimes, but it doesn't.
Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's a little bit of a tight squeeze, and one more person has to come in.
Hang on. There we go.
Okay, now, word of warning, I will tell you that when I push that go button, the lift is going to start with a little bit of a jump, but that's normal, okay? Don't be embarrassed if you squeal. I've heard grown men squeal when it happens, so it's all good. We can do this. We can do it. Oh my God. Oh, hang on. Minus my jacket. There we go. I will count us down though. 3, 2, 1. welcome to level 2 of the Central Deborah Gold Mine. Now at this stage I'll get everyone to turn their cap lamps on so you can see where you're going. There's a big red box at the top. And what I'm going to get everyone to do is to head through those double doors in front of us and walk up towards that mine truck in the centre of the tunnel. Now, those doors are heavy. You will need to hold them open for the person behind you. I'll be there in a second. Can I open it?
That blinding?
The best coffee ever is that. Sorry, just a kill a coffee drink. Awesome. Come this way. Alright, I want you guys to form a semicircle in front of me. I will point out closest to me you are, but let's see you're going to get. So maybe head over that way. People come out of this way. Come on down. Everyone needs to be able to see what's behind me. That's the important part. Mini miners to the front. So if there's anyone shorter than you behind you, you might want to switch places. Okay. You guys going to be okay having some water dripping on you for a little bit? You okay? Oh, good. All right. This is my 5th shower today, standing right here. It's lovely. Now you are now standing 61 metres directly underneath that white coppered head. So I know how I had everyone sort of gathered around on the surface to have a look at the mine shaft. You're pretty much standing in the exact same space, 61 metres deep underground. How cool is that? Just wait a minute. Did I leave that open or did I? It is close. Oh, that's okay. As in the actual gate of the. I never used to be able to see that. I just closed this gate. Remember that? I was like, oh no, they can't be called a lift if it's down like that. So this is the same mine shaft that I showed you up on the surface. These 2 compartments here is where the cages would go up and down with the miners and all their equipment. Over here is the smoke box. Now this worked like a chimney. It drew out all of the smoke and the fumes from the blasting that they did. And over here is the ladderway. Now back in the 1940s, when this was a working gold mine, that ladderway there was the miner's emergency exit. I promise you we have better emergency exits today. If something happens to that lift, I'm not making you climb those ladders up to the surface. Unless you really want to, then go ahead. So the ladders go from the surface right down to the bottom of this mine. Remember, this mine is 422 metres deep. If you were working on the lowest level, level 17 of this mine, and those cages there stopped working for some reason, it was a 2.5-hour climb from the bottom back up to the top. 2.5 hours. That was 2.5 hours at the end of your very long, hard-working day of digging out rock. And you had to carry out all of your gear as well. Everything you brought down with you had to come back out again. So the miners didn't want the cages to stop working, but of course technical difficulties did occur, and there were reported cases of the miners on level 17 having to climb their way out. That's how we know it takes 2.5 hours, because we were not going to test that theory. That's a little bit too much of a climb for me. I've climbed down from the surface to this level before, 61 metres. And let me tell you now, I was using leg muscles that I hadn't used in a very long time, so the next day I was walking like this. It was so painful. So I can hardly imagine what it was like for the miners who had to climb up 422 metres to the surface and then come to work the next day and do their hard working work.
And then broke again.
Yeah, I know. I can imagine. Oh yeah, and they have to climb it out again. Again! Now you're probably wondering why there is so much water underground. The water table here in Bendigo is just a couple of feet below the surface. So keeping on top of the constantly rising water levels is always a problem in Bendigo mining. Now, to keep on top of the rising water here at Central Deborah Gold Mine back in the day, what the night shift crew would do is they would come in at the end of the day, unhook the cages that the miners took down during the day, they'd set them aside, and replace them with large bailing tanks. Now a bailing tank is like a giant bucket, and that bucket can hold about 1,100 litres of water. They would plunge that bucket down to the bottom of the gold mine. They'd let it fill up with water. They'd bring it back up to the surface. All that water was flushed off into the Bendigo Creek, and then they'd do it again, and again, and again, 80 times a night. That's how much water would build up at the bottom of the shaft every day. Now, we don't use the bailing tanks today. We've got electric pumps on level 10 constantly pumping water out of this mine. It's about 2 million litres a day. Now, we can't really use that water for much. All the water, like really far down beneath us, has arsenic in it from the arsenopyrite. Not so much this stuff, but I don't recommend you licking the rocks. No. So this water doesn't have arsenic in it, but the stuff underneath us, it does. It also has hydrogen sulfide in it. Hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs. It's not pleasant. If you're going for a walk in Roslyn Park along the Bendigo Creek and you get a whiff of rotten egg, don't immediately assume that it's the person you're standing next to. It is just letting you know that you're walking over an old mine shaft and that the water has risen right to the top of that. So unfortunately, it's the smell of Bendigo. You're walking along the suburbs, you get rotten egg, it's like, oh yeah, mine shaft. They're everywhere here in Bendigo. All right, I am thoroughly drenched. Who agrees with me that we should go to somewhere much drier? Yes. Yes. Oh, thank goodness. I'll answer any questions up at the dry part. I clean my shoes before. I only just came in this morning. I here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine worked an 8-hour shift underground. They had half an hour for lunch. Do you think they had their lunches back up on the surface or deep underground? Deep underground, they did. One major reason for that, and that is you've got a tiny cage that carries 4 miners at a time, and about 40 miners working down underground every shift, trying to get all 40 back up to the surface for a half-hour lunch break in a tiny cage just wasn't working for them. So the mine manager said, you know what? You can stay underground the entire time. But they did dig out a nice little room for themselves to eat their lunches in. This is their lunchroom, or their crib room. And I will point out to you, however, that their lunchroom was not this big. In fact, the tunnels that we're walking along were not this spacious. This is luxury compared to what they had to work in. Now, the Cornish miners who worked underneath Bendigo, a lot of them were not tall. They were about 5'2" on average. My mum's side of the family come from Cornwall. My mum is 5'1". I can put my chin on her head. She thinks it's adorable. I got some of my dad's genes though, so that's why I'm a little bit tall. But her father and his father, they were all quite short. Now the tunnels didn't need to be much taller than the miners themselves. So there's my mum there at 5'1", a little bit taller than that, 5'2", and then so a little bit taller than that. So there we go. That was how tall the tunnels were. And then just wide enough to push one of those mine trucks through. That's it. That's the tunnel size that they worked in. So as I said, luxury. Now, did anyone get that reference? No Monty Python fancy. Oh my goodness. All right. So they also didn't have electricity underground either. No fancy lighting at all. In the early days of mining here in Bendigo, everything was done using candlelight. So this little contraption here is called a spider. Now this is the only type of spider you will get here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine. You will not get the creepy crawly types down here. There's nothing for them to eat this far down, so they just don't come down here. If you are afraid of spiders, guess what? No spiders. Usually I get someone going, oh. That also means no rats, no rodents of any type, no bats, no snakes, no lizards, no anything. In fact, the only life down here, apart from us, is some iron oxidizing bacteria around the other side. That's it. Us and some microbes. It's all the life down here. Now, this spider, They would sit that between a couple of planks of wood. Of course, if they didn't have planks of wood underground, they'd chisel it out, a little hole for it to sit in. And that's what held a candle. And that's what they would work by, the light of one candle. That's not very bright, to be honest. If you tried to find gold in quartz by the light of one candle, you were going to miss a lot. So in the early 1900s, they developed what's known as the carbide lamp. Now, calcium carbide is a man-made mineral. It reacts with water to produce acetylene gas. That's the same gas that's used in oxy-welding. The very first thing the miners did at the beginning of their shift before they came underground is they went to the carbide lamp room up on the surface and they grabbed themselves one of these canisters and they filled it up with calcium carbide. They would then plunge that into a bucket of water, like so. There's a tiny hole at the top of that canister, and that's where the water would seep in. You get that chemical reaction between the carbide and the water, and the gas that it produced would travel up along this nozzle. They would light that with a match, and that produced a flame that was 15 times brighter than candlelight. Much more effective to work by. They could actually see where they were going. Now, the miners here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine continued using those carbide lamps well into the 1940s, even when cap lamps, like what you're wearing today, became available, for one very important reason, and that is fire needs oxygen to burn. And of course, the miners need oxygen to breathe. That's how they could figure out whether or not there was enough air underground. If the flames started to flicker and die out, but they knew they still had a fair amount of carbide in that canister, it was because they didn't have enough air underground. They had to do something about it. So here in Bendigo, what a lot of the mines did was actually met up with a neighbouring mine shaft. The tunnels would meet halfway, and you get natural airflow underground that way. The saying is you can walk from one side of Bendigo to the other underground. All of the tunnels are interconnected in some way. The reason for that was that they needed to get air underground. That's pretty cool. Using science. Now, the last thing I'm going to show you whilst we're here is the miner's hard hat that they wore underground. Now, it mightn't look like much, and honestly all it is the flannelette of the shirts that they wore. Yes, flannelette. They would mould it into shape, and then they would lacquer it with a hard glue. That is it. So not exactly up to today's safety standards by a long shot. The mine manager always wore a hard hat on his head. He wanted to set a really good example for the miners who worked underneath him. But I can tell you right now, as soon as he left the area, the miners would take the hard hats off. They didn't have the rules and regulations that we do today. Now, I never recommend taking your hard hat off when you're underground. Indeed, the miner who was wearing this one was probably really glad he was doing so, because instead of a hole in his hard hat, he would have had a hole in his head. So we estimate that that would have been a rock about the size of my fist, doing that damage right there. Now, thankfully, if a rock that big hit our hard hats today, it would not do that much damage. Our hard hats are not made from flannelette, which is a good thing. It's probably something or other. I can't quite remember it off the top of my head. But imagine what would have happened if the miner wasn't wearing anything at all and a rock that big hit your head. Ouch. You don't want to use it though. They did school. That's really, really nice. Now, the miners underground worked 8.5 hours, but didn't go up to the surface at all during that time. And unless you've got the bladder of a camel, you're going to need to go to the toilet at some stage. And this is it, the miner's toilet. And they nicknamed this the Thunderbox. I'll leave that to your imaginations as to why they called it the Thunderbox. Now, it was the responsibility of the youngest miner, the apprentice, to take that bucket up at the end of every shift. Who's my youngest miner here? I wouldn't make you do that, no, not at all. But of course, they gave the job to the one person who couldn't complain about it, the apprentice. come this way. I'm going to talk about this wooden structure that we're looking at right now.
I was wondering what happened there.
Is that in there?
So whenever the miners needed to reinforce the rock, make sure it was safe and solid and nothing was going to fall down on their heads, they built a wooden structure like this one right here. This is called a timber set. Now the important part of a timber set are these logs on top. They're called lagging, and that's designed to stop the rocks from falling on the miners' heads. Now you might notice that there are little to no nails involved in the building of a timber set. In damp conditions underground, the miners tried to avoid using nails because they would rust through. So all of these wooden structures were built using timbering and joinery skills. Now timbering was just one of the many skills that a miner had to know to become fully competent, and it was a 5-year apprenticeship before you were qualified. So that's 5 years of taking that bucket up at the end of every shift. I know, that was the takeaway part of that when I was learning it. So 5 years, oh my goodness. Now, as you were walking along, before we reached the thunderbox down there, to your right, some of you might have noticed a very large empty room. That is our underground function room. Now, it's not historically accurate in the slightest. The miners did not have a large fancy room in which to eat their lunches. We dug that out when we turned this into a tourist mine. Now, we've had birthday parties underground. How would you like to have a birthday party? 61 metres underground. So cool. The best birthday party ever. We've had wedding receptions in there as well. Orchestra Victoria has played in there. And in the early 1990s, just after it was dug out, my dad's rock band, the Rockin' Donkeys, played in there. Now, he told me that they played so loud that they cracked through the rock. I was 6 years old at this stage, and I believed every word he said. So when I first started working here, I went down to that room, and I was like, okay, I'm going to see this crack. This is going to be so exciting. My dad has told me all about this crack. That's the day that I found out that my dad had been fibbing to me for the longest time. The rock underneath Bendigo is far too hard for a loud rock band to crack its way through. In fact, that room there is the most highly fortified room underneath the Central Deborah Gold mine, on this level at least. And for that reason, that room is our emergency assembly point. So if something happens underground, you'll follow me down to that room. I have ways of getting us back up to the surface from there. Now, I'm also one of the people that does the inventory on all the supplies underground. So I can tell you, if we do need to wait down there for any amount of time, we will be having a party because there's a lot of chocolate and chips. You are welcome. However, I've been told told by my boss that I'm not allowed to fake an emergency to eat the chocolate and chips. So I'm sorry. So only in an emergency. Or if we're really peckish. No, an emergency. All right, come with me this way.
Yep. I did know that.
It's very sparkly.
If we're going we might need to just move the Yeah. There we go. You can see now. Get Dad to carry you. All right. So, whenever the miners needed to test the rock to make sure it was safe and secure and nothing was going to fall on their heads, they'd use a technique that they call the sounding of the backs. Now, the back is a mining term. It just means the ceiling or the roof of the tunnel. What they do is they grab a steel bar, like this one here, and they tap the rock like so. And they'll be listening out for the noise that it made. That high-pitched like noise there, that's a really good noise. That means it's nice and solid, and that's not going to come down on our heads, which is good. But sometimes they'll come across a noise like this one here. That's not a good noise. That's called a drummy sound. That means that that rock there is loose. Well, not that one in particular. We've purposefully made that hollow behind there for demonstration purposes. So you usually get at least one person a day going, should we be tapping on that rock? Get rid of it. It's not going to fall off, it's all good. Now, whenever the miners heard that noise there, they do one of two things. They'd either get there with a pinch bar, and they would remove the rock from the rock face. Now, that's called scaling or barring down, but it was too dangerous to do that if they thought far too much rock was going to come off and do some damage. That's when they would build those timber sets. Now, they don't build timber sets anymore, though. I'm just going to pop this in here and grab the other ones. Timber sets take a long time to build and use a lot of wood. And that wood is now an endangered species in Bendigo thanks to mining box ironbark. There's not many trees left from back in the day. We are replanting them, but technically there are less than 10 left in Bendigo. And they're all in the suburb of Ironbark. So these days what miners use is this thing here. It's called a rock bolt. What the miners do is they drill a hole into the rock. Now there's a hole just behind your head up there. Now that hole is about the same length as a rock bolt, but slightly smaller in diameter. So you've really got to force it into that hole. They then thread this rock bolt through one of these metal end plates. So you've been walking along, you've been seeing these square plates all along the wall. It just works like a washer holding this in place. Then using their rock drill, they force this into the hole across the layers of rock, and it works like a pin or a nail holding the layers of rock together. Now one of these, it doesn't actually look like much, but it can hold up to 9 tons, so it's pretty impressive. However, remember how I was telling you that the miners tried to avoid using nails underground because they rust through? So do rock bolts. So every now and then, you'll walk along, you'll see a rock bolt, and right next to it, a rather rusty rock bolt. We do need to replace it time and time again. So the miners had the right idea, trying to avoid using that sort of material. Okay, so you are all in a gold mine. What is it that you want to see in a gold mine? Gold. 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 Silver. Emerald. Gold. Come with me this way.
That's the original.
And I'll give you a little bit of time at the end of it to have a look at this as well. Now, this here is exactly what the miners were looking for. This is a quartz reef. Now, this reef here is actually quite tiny compared to the reefs on the lower level. Some of those were meters tall. But more importantly, you'll see that there are some very, very special minerals in this quartz. There's gold. Hooray! That's what the miners wanted to see. There's also iron pyrite. Now, iron pyrite has a nickname. Does anyone know what that nickname is?
Fool's gold.
It is fool's gold. We have gold and we have fool's gold. Now, there's a tiny amount of gold in fool's gold. When I say tiny, I mean really, really quite tiny. It is less than 3% gold. But the miners here did actually capture up the iron pyrite along with the gold, took it away to get that gold out. Now, a little bit of geology, a little bit more geology, I should say. The rocks underneath Bendigo are incredibly unique. We're well known for our quartz reef structure, so this white rock here. It's called a saddle reef. You get saddle reefs in 2 places in the world. Underneath Bendigo, and then the other side of the world, underneath Nova Scotia in Canada. That's it. To get a quartz reef, I want everyone to imagine 480 million years ago. Where you're standing right now used to be the bottom of the ocean floor. Now we are talking way before the dinosaurs here. You've got layers of sand and mud hardening into layers of sandstone and slate. So the 2 grey rocks I showed you up on the surface are the grey rocks that you see around you right now. Then I want you to jump ahead about 50 million years, still before the dinosaurs. You've got pressure from the east and the west forcing these layers of rock to buckle and fold until you've got a saddle structure like that. Now when the layers of rock folded, cracks formed between the layers, and molten solutions of silica from deep within the Earth's crust just forced up into those cracks. Now that silica contained minerals, such as gold and iron pyrite. when the silica cooled and hardened, quartz that the miners were after. Now, to cover the costs of mining back in the 1940s, so to pay the miners' wages, to fix any faulty equipment, and of course to please the investors, who were sinking a lot of money into these mines, for every 1 ton of quartz that the miners brought up to the surface, they needed to extract from that at least 10 grams of gold. Now, 1 ton of quartz is 2 of those mine trucks, chock-a-block full. That's 1 ton. 10 grams of gold is the tip of your pinky finger. That's it. Then that would be enough to cover the costs of mining for 1 week. Now, over here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine, they were mining out tons and tons of gold, tons and tons of quartz, and finding next to no gold. The Central Deborah Mining Company was not successful. This mine ran for 15 years. It started in 1939 and finished in 1954, and in that time they found just under 1 ton of gold, 929 kilograms. When you melt that down, that becomes the size of a milk crate, so not much at all. To put things into perspective for you, the North Deborah Gold Mine, the same quartz reef, 500 metres up the road, different mining company, ran for 2 extra years. They ran for 17 years. And in their time, they found just under 5 tons. So 5 of those milk crates, 2 extra years on top of this. And when we found barely 1 milk crate. So yeah, we weren't that successful here, unfortunately. Now, when the Central Deborah Mining Company shut up shop, left the site, they did something that was highly unusual. They left everything to gather dust. Usually when a mine closes down, they relocate the puppet head to another site, they sell off all the machinery, and all that's left is a big hole in the ground with a sheet of corrugated iron over the top of it for safety that kids back in the day used to use as a trampoline. I kid you not. Now, we don't know why they left everything as is, but we're really glad that they did, because it meant when the Bendigo Trust came in looking for a potential tourist site, all they had to do was dust off all the old machinery on the surface, make sure underground was safe to go adventuring under, and what once was one of the least successful gold mines in Bendigo is now the most successful tourist attraction in Bendigo. We're making far more money now than they ever did as a gold mine. Now, we found this gold along here when we were making the tunnels wider for tour groups. So the miners back in the day had no idea that sort of a metre or so to the side of their tiny little tunnel was all this gold. That's what happens in gold mining, unfortunately. Now, a lot of people ask us why we don't mine this out. I mean, we could, but for the longest time, we had no idea what was behind it. So in the 1990s, some miners actually dug a tunnel up and around behind this display to see if there was any more gold. They didn't find much. So we decided to keep this here, because we prefer to have this here to show people what golden quartz looks like. So we didn't touch it, which is probably a good thing for you, because you can now take photos. So go ahead. And once you've done that, follow me up this way.
Looks like a chunk of gold.
It's quartz.
Yeah, but what exactly is
To look at the block, it's loads of gold. Some it has gold. It has gold in it, but it's so minute. This is where the gold is. See the put markers on it.
Chisel into it. But they've got a
See, do you see?
extract the gold from the rock.
God, it's such a
So
small
you
amount,
need to
isn't
get
it?
living on property, my love.
So, yeah.
See? We've got lots of this.
I mean,
Oh, there's
if
some
I
in there.
had an estimate, then sure.
See? This and
Oh, that's pyrite. That's half the gold there.
Go outside and find
Come
it.
on.
Oh, yeah.
I've still got quartz in the back of my car.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Actually,
I'm actually trying to locate that with a camera.
All right. There's a little bit more. We just squeeze up a little bit here on the other side. You guys there, I'm going to be tapping that rock a little bit, so I might get you guys to stand over this side as well. Okay, here we go. All right then. So the rocks underneath Bendigo are incredibly hard. Now I'm talking sometimes 7 times harder than concrete. Concrete's pretty hard. Now, in some Hollywood movies and games like Minecraft, you might see a miner with a pickaxe go up to the rock, and they'll do this a couple of times, and the rock falls apart. Every time I watch that in movies, I'm like, that's not going to happen. No way. In a hard rock mine like this, you cannot get through using a pickaxe. You have to drill holes into the rock. You have to pack those holes with explosives, and kaboom, you have to blast your way through. Now, in the early days of mining, they did this the hard way. It's called the hammer and tap method. You have a chisel-ended steel bar and a sledgehammer. You put the steel bar against the rock and you go tap, twist, tap, twist, tap. And you would continue doing this until you had chiseled away at the rock a 1 meter deep hole. Doing it this way would usually take you about 4 hours to do one hole. 4 hours. Then you needed upwards of about 20 holes before you could blast through. So it was a long and hard job. Now, one miner could do this, but usually you had a team of 2 or 3, one holding the steel bar, 2 with sledgehammers. It was slightly faster. However, this was the technique that they were using when they still only had candlelight. So not a lot of light to see by, and they were doing this for hours and hours on end. So I always felt so sorry for the poor miner whose job it was to hold the steel bar, because unfortunately, sometimes at the end of his shift, he'd come up to the surface and he would have broken fingers because they'd accidentally miss. Yeah, I know, right? So they were really, really excited when rock drills were invented, fewer broken fingers, amongst other things. So in the 1870s, this rock drill over here was invented, the reciprocator rock drill. It's basically a mechanical version of the hammer and tap that I just showed you. So you had one miner here pushing and pulling along the lever, and that would force the drill steel back and forth. And then you had another miner twisting it so it would chisel at the rock. So exactly the same, just much bigger. Now this machine here could drill a 1 meter deep hole in 40 minutes. Much faster than doing it 4 hours. However, there was a massive problem with this machine. As it chipped away at the rock, it created clouds of dust. This dust has a natural form of glass in it. It's called silica. The miners were breathing in silica and they developed a lung disease called silicosis, or miner's complaint. Now, the miners who used this machine here very rarely lived past the age of 40. Now, sad but true story. My great-grandfather was a miner here in Bendigo. He was a Cornish miner. In the early days of his mining career, this was the machine that he used. He passed away from silicosis at the age of 34. I'm 37, so it really puts things into perspective for me. I still consider myself to be quite young, and he was younger than me when he passed away. And because of its tragic history, the miners who used this machine here nicknamed it the Widowmaker. But they knew that this machine caused problems, so they did invent something better. They invented the drifter rock drill. Now, the drifter is what they used here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine. Its advantage is this hose that pumps water through a hollow drill steel. So instead of having clouds of dust coming out of the hole that the miners were breathing in, it had a mud or a sludge that just poured out and onto the ground. The miners were no longer breathing in as much glass. In fact, the miners who used this here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine, some of them lived to be 70 years of age. Back then, it was actually pretty good. Now, this was also a much faster drill. It could drill a 1.5 meter deep hole in 20 minutes. And I can show you just what it was like when it was used. Now, it is incredibly loud, so I'll need everyone to cover their ears. I'm just going to...
It doesn't even listen.
So you can hold that and film. There you go. Got it. All right, ears covered. 3, 2, 1.
Now I can see when it went down.
Woo-hoo. Turn that off there. I'll grab those earmuffs from you. Thank you kindly. Now, very important question. Do you think the miners who use this machine here for about 3 hours every day wore ear protection?
Nope.
Not at all, no. So they were going home at the end of their shift with ringing in their ears, tinnitus or tinnitus, and by the end of their mining careers, they had very little hearing left. Now, even though they were living longer lives because they weren't developing silicosis, their quality of life still wasn't great. So they were losing their hearing. Now, when you're holding this for about 3, maybe 4 hours a day, it's vibrating up your arm, you're holding it like this. They were developing like white knuckle and arthritis and stuff like that. Because of the amount of water coming out to the ground, they were developing diseases in their feet, like trench foot. They didn't have really good foot boots like this. So it still wasn't a great job when it came to health and safety, unfortunately. All right, any questions before we move on to our next?
Just go through it.
Yeah.
Now there's only 2 more displays, so if you're starting to get cold, I promise you we're going to go up into the sunshine very soon, okay? Alright, so there's a little bit of science involved in blasting the rock apart. It's not a case of getting there with your rock and drilling holes wherever you wanted to. There were patterns that the miners had to follow. Now the important thing to consider when you are blasting through rock is the direction that that rock is blasting towards. The last place you want that rock to go is out into the tunnel. If it went out into the tunnel, it could damage those timber sets. It could damage the miners' equipment. It could also damage the miners themselves. You didn't want that to happen. So, the patterns were designed to control the direction that the rock blasted towards. This pattern right here in the middle, this is called the burn cut. What the miners did is they would drill a huge central weakness hole right in the middle of where they wanted the tunnel. This hole here had absolutely no explosives in it. They would then drill smaller holes out and around, up and down, until it was the height and the width of the tunnel that they wanted. This hole was incredibly important. When you've got such a huge force behind a blast, the rock is looking to go to what's called the path of least resistance. Now, if that rock wasn't there, the path of least resistance that this rock was going to go towards was out into the tunnel. You didn't want that, so that's what this hole came in handy for. This was a weakness point that forced the rock in towards it. So these would go off first, and they would go boom. The rock will go into the middle. Then boom, still into the middle. And then boom, and the hole will get bigger and bigger and bigger. What I'm going to do, I'm going to show you the sequence. I'm pushing a button. Now I promise you when I do push this button, nothing's actually going to explode. It is just a light and sound show. I will count down though, just so you're not too scared.
Is it loud?
It's a little bit loud, but not as loud as that drill. But I'll count down. So if it does get loud, you can put your fingers in your ears, okay? So 3, 2, 1. Once they let the dust settle for a couple of hours, there would be a huge pile of rock. Now the explosives that they used were sticks of gelignite. They put about 3 or 4 of these into each of the holes. The one at the end had the detonator attached to it, and then attached to that was your fuse wire. In like that, just like the old movies. Now, lighting the fuses was the very last thing the miners did at the end of their shift. They lit the fuses and made their way very calmly back towards the cages to go up to the surface. Now, do you think they went up to the top before all the explosions happened, or do you think they stayed underground? They stayed underground. They had to count all of the booms. So you had 20 holes. How many booms did you want to hear? 20. Yes, exactly. If they only heard 19, it meant that there was some unexploded gelignite sticks. That was incredibly unsafe. That were the case, they then had to tell the next crew that were coming down to dig out the rock to be incredibly careful. They had to find those sticks of gelignite before they did anything else. Because if they didn't, and they just started shoveling, and their shovel hit a stick of gelignite, what do you think would happen? Boom, while they were standing on top of it. Exactly. Thankfully, no one here was caught in a gelignite blast. It wasn't the case with other mines in the area, though. The reason why the Central Deborah was so safe was that Tommy Rope, the mine manager, was a demolitions expert. At the end of every shift, he came down. He double-checked the explosives. You were not allowed to set them off until he gave the okay. For that reason, we believe that's why this mine was so safe, and there was no fatalities, no deaths, due to unexploded gelignite sticks. There was one death here. There was a gentleman whose nickname was Possum. He was down on level 16, the second to lowest level here, and he was doing some scaling. So he had that metal bar and he was removing loose rock from the rock face. Now he accidentally just removed a little bit too much, unfortunately, and he was caught underneath it when it fell down. Now one fatality, one death in 15 years was considered incredibly safe for a gold mine. This was also one of the only mines in the area that had their own first aid room. You didn't have to have one, but they took safety really, really, really seriously here. All right, I have one more display to show you underground, but before we head down that way, any questions? So, the process of removing rock from underground, taking it up to the surface, in Australia, has a specific term. We call it bogging. Now, the miners here at the Central Deborah Gold Mine used one of these to bog with. You and I, we'd call this a shovel, wouldn't we? Mm-hmm. The miners did not call this a shovel. They had a nickname for it, the banjo. Now the reason why it was called banjo was if you were to scrape the shovel along quartz like this, it does actually sound like you are strumming a banjo. Now that certainly didn't. It does have to be the quartz. And if you ask my honest opinion, I'd say maybe poorly tuned banjo, but still a banjo. So the very first thing that the miners were met with at the beginning of their shift is a huge pile of rock. They needed to remove that rock from the mine, take it up to the surface for sorting, so that they had enough room to bring in their rock drills, drill holes into the rock, pack those holes with explosives, kaboom, and do the whole thing over and over. So they would grab their trusty banjo and they would start digging, and they'd fill up mine trucks right to the brim. When it's chock-a-block full, those mine trucks weigh half a ton. They'd then be pushing that sometimes 500 metres back to the shaft to go up to the surface. Now, depending on how much rock was made from the explosions, they could be doing that upwards of about 40 times a shift. So they were incredibly fit. Now, in the 1930s in America, this machine here was invented, the rocker shovel. Well, everywhere in the world calls it the rocker shovel, except for here in Australia. We had to get the term bogger in there somewhere, so we call this a rail bogger, because it runs on rails. We're very, very ingenious with naming things. Now, this machine makes removing rock from underground 10 times easier. It just scoops it up in the bucket and dumps it over into the mine truck. It's so much easier to use. If you were to fill one of those trucks over there using a shovel, it took 12 minutes. If you were using this machine here, it took 2 minutes. Much faster. Now, unfortunately, I can't demonstrate its use at the moment. The technology that we have underground at the Central Deborah Gold Mine, it's all old technology. It's the original stuff that the miners use. That means if something breaks, we not only have to find somewhere that can make the part, a lot of places don't make parts like this anymore, and then we have to find someone who knows how to fix it. Now, unfortunately, it's taking a little bit longer than we had anticipated. So it's not working at the moment, I'm sorry to say. But what I can do is show you just how it's used. So, you've got two levers here. This lever controls the bogger forwards and backwards along the track. This lever controls the bucket up, over, into the mine truck, back down again. So, your miner's standing here, you move it forwards, you lift the bucket up, you go backwards, you dump the bucket into the truck, you go forwards again, you lift the rock up, and so on and so forth. much easier to use. I can tell you that now for sure. Now that's the very last thing that I have to show you underground. We're about to head around the corner back to the lift that we came down in. Before we do go that way, just a couple of safety things. Number one, this is the wettest part of the tunnel. So I want everyone to take your time, watch your step, go as slow as you need to go, okay? Please don't slip over and hurt yourselves. I desperately don't want the last thing that you remember of this tour being a soggy bottom. So take your time. Number two, just reiterating that this is the lowest part of the tunnel too. So anyone who's taller than me, please watch your heads. All right, I'm going to jump to the front so I can point out a couple of puddles along the way. But before I do that, last chance. Any questions? That's okay. That's all right. If you do think of something, I'm right up here. Follow me. You call me.
Get back
You wear white shoes. Beautiful. Yeah. I don't know if it's coming out. Oh, look at them all playing again. Lucky. How do you turn this lighter?
All right, now we're going to squeeze in. We can do this though because we did it on the way down. It's the same lift. I promise you. It might look smaller, but it's not.
Oops.
All right, so when I push the go button this time, it's not going to start with a jump, but it will finish with one. So I'll warn you when that is. Just need to close this off. And then watch your shoulder there. But we will head up on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. All right, at this stage, you'll get everyone to turn your cap lamps off. Push the red button a couple of times. There are 3 settings. Now, if you want to know if your cap lamp is still on, if you put your hand in front of it and the light's shining on your hand, it means the cap lamp is still on. I suppose she is.
Did you have a look through the miners' showers and change?
Back in the 1850s, the easiest way to find gold was to pan for in the Bendigo Creek. Here is a step-by-step guide on how to pan for gold. Take a gold pan, roll up your sleeves, and pick a pan. Hold the pan with the ridges facing away from you. Scoop up some sand from the bottom of the top, about 3/4 of a pan. Line is heavy, so dig as deep as you can. Switch the pan around in water to wash the flow of sand and stones off. This moves all of the gold to the bottom of the pan. Tip the pan slightly away from you and swirl the pan around in the water. The waste rock and sand is washed out of the gold pan. When you only have water, swirl the sand in the pan.
What if I said gold?
And you've got to have a track.
Pull it towards you and swirl it around so that the water makes waves around the pan. As the sand washes away from the pan, the gold will be left behind. The gold should stick. Gold pan takes a lot of pressure and swirl the pan around in the water so that the waste rock and sand is washed out of the gold pan by this. When you only have a tablespoon of sand left in the pan, it is time to find gold. Put a small amount of water in the pan, tilt it towards you and swirl it around so that the water makes waves around the pan. As the sand washes away from the top of the pan, the gold will be left behind. To pick up the gold, use a dry finger to which the gold should stick. Gold panning takes a lot of patience, but don't worry, there are other treasures in that trough. Keep your eyes open. There are small gems in the troughs. These have little holes in them that can be made into jewellery. Happy gold panning at the Central Deborah Gold Mine. Back in the 1850s, the easiest way to find gold was to pan for it in the Bendigo Creek. Here is a step-by-step guide on how to pan for gold. Take a gold pan, roll up your sleeves and pick a trough to pan in. Hold the pan with the ridges facing away from you. Scoop up some sand from the bottom of the trough, about 3/4 of a pan full. Gold is heavy, so dig it. The easiest way to find gold was to pan for it.
Built on gold and the rush to discover its hidden treasure.
Gold! Ah, you beauty! Gold!
What if I
Gold,
found that in the trough?
a metal that has special
What if I just picked
qualities.
up?
Gold, an element that has embodied wealth,
We have a golden
security
nugget.
and success
Don't we have a
through the
golden
history
nugget?
of civilization.
Do we have a golden
Gold,
nugget?
we can't get enough of it.
Dirty bloody job, mate. But I suppose someone's got to do it.
That's what it looks like underneath Bendigo.
You know, we mine a hell of a lot of rock out of this hole. The little bit of glittering stuff we find makes all the difference.
That's gold.
Gold, golden era, Bendigo, a city built on gold
Flooded?
and a rush to
Oh,
discover
because,
its
you get...
When they get it going again, you can go down and roll. So you're far off.
Dirty bloody job, mate. But I suppose someone's going to do it. Mind you, we can make a good quid out of it. You know, we mine a hell of a lot of rock out of this hole. A little bit of glittering stuff we find makes all of it.
She barely.
No, because I accidentally touched the glass over there and that alarm went off and I'm like, oh my god. I could annoy people with this. It's really annoying. $23.95 an hour.
That would be per week.
Per week.
Weekly wages, 1952.
Weekly. No, you make that an hour.
So the poor old bloke that's shoveling is the lowest paid, $18.55.
Oh, who's on 45?
The contract miner. Isn't that like the boss?
Mine manager,
Big boss.
that is 6.
Oh, hang on. Oh, this is what they cost. 3-year-old Ford Ute, $1,370.
Look, this is like.
You know, we mine a hell of a lot of rock out of this hole. A little bit of glittering stuff we find makes all of it.
Whitford House, 2004.
Wow.